Hello, everyone. My name is Joyner, and I'm the president of the National Association of Social Workers. And today we have a show that is filled up with great information. So we want you to be attentive. We want you to think of questions, relevant questions that you would have for any of the guests that are on our show. Uh, I usually start with a song, but there'll be no song today. Um, I want to say Happy New Year to everyone who's entered 2020, 2023, but hold on to your seats because here we are in January 19th, and we have seen some major shifts on the federal level as well as in the state level. So much so that it's actually confusing. You actually want to turn it off. You actually want to say, I can't take in anymore. But that's the thing that I asked all social workers not to do. Recently, I had a call from NPR that the program at University of Southern California, Susan Peck Center, Department, College, Sue, excuse me for messing that up a little bit, but they took it upon themselves, the students, to take out the word field from all of the curriculum within USC. Now, it was only within their department. It was only as it pertained to social work. Students said that the word field has negative connotations for Latinos who are in California, and the program is based in California and around, to saying gone out and picking grapes, or it's associated with low pay. And African Americans certainly attest to the fact being in the field was picking cotton. Either you were inside or outside. And those things really kind of make one think, why are we still using those words? So, what the students did is they did their own research. They went to their curriculum committee to see how making a change would affect them. And we do know the levels. Anybody that works in academia knows that it's about 6 or 7 levels to get the curriculum changed. But you know what? They did it. They did it because they said this definitely affects individuals and especially those who are vulnerable. And so they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to be a program that was known as that. So they took all the necessary steps to bend that arc of justice towards equity for all. And they got it done. But as soon as it happened, it hit the wires. Some social workers even saying that's so silly. That is trivial. Why would social work even take its time to do such a mindless thing? But let's think about it. Why do social workers and others attack people who are taking offensive language and changing it and treating people with dignity and respect, which is what we must do as we practice our code of ethics? And I applauded them because I was like, here is a group of students that did the necessary change, that brought change and eradicated the field from the social work program. Because you heard some people saying now when the Trojans go on the ball field, right, football field, they can't use that word. That's not what they said. And you had people starting to script what the meaning of that was. Social workers, we can do better than that. We can be supportive of people who make changes. And we don't always have to be critical. It's not always going to be perfect to bend that arc of justice, but it is now necessary. We had a governor in Arkansas that was just came in, uh, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, or Sando, yeah, Huckabee Sanders. And you know what her one of her duties was, one of her executive orders? Can't use Latin X anymore. Now, do you think she followed the steps of the USC students where she went and she asked her staff and her department heads, how would this impact if we do that? No, she just made those changes. We have another state in Virginia that changed the HOV or trying to put policy through that the HOV lane, as long as you are pregnant, you can ride in that lane at the moment that the fetus is there. How is an officer going to actually carry out that? And what is it really doing? It's saying to women early on that we are considering at the time of inception that your child has rights. And then there's the state of Pennsylvania that's gutting the curriculum, removing names like Martin Luther King Jr., removing names because they have a story to tell. Some states want to take out slavery and say that people just came here voluntarily to work. Why isn't social work responding to those issues? That's what we're here to talk about today. You're going to need to be as busy as ever. You're going to be needed to be busy on the federal level as well as in the state level, because it's our states that levels that are making some real big changes. But you're going to learn tonight what actions you can take to change that. Now, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, which is why you hear me mixing up some of my words. So I actually asked a guru to join me, and that's Marla Blunt Carter. Marla is going to have our panelists speak, integrate these questions, ask some hard questions, because Marla asked some hard questions that Marla always talks about. But what are you going to do? It's great to talk. It's great to say, oh, wow, I have the privilege of stepping away. We saw that today in Australia, where a prime minister, because this is just not a United States problem, this is a global problem, stepped away. But not everybody can step away
That's
from
right.
these problems. So, Marla, take it over. You all have a great show. Thank you for joining us. And I'm sure you're going to learn more than you thought. Marla?
Thank you. Thank you, Mitch, so much. And even on your worst day, you're better than most of us. So,
Mm,
take care of yourself, and thank you for your role model of being a leader and a fighter for justice.
thank you.
I appreciate you so much, and I am more than happy to fill in and do my best to get this discussion going. So thank you, and be well.
Okay. I'm going to go listen to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
we're going to kick it off. And as Mitch said, she invited some dynamic people to have this discussion with. And I want to start it off with Congressman Wheat. If Congressman, if you could introduce yourself, the Honorable former Congressman Alan Wheat.
Marla, thank you very much. And first, let me say how much I appreciate the invitation from Mitt to be here this evening. I was supposed to be on the last show with our show immediately prior to the election, helping to make election predictions.
Mhm.
And I came down with a bad case of COVID at that time, so couldn't make it. So I appreciate the fact that Mitt could be here this evening for even a short time, even though she's not feeling well. And I also appreciate the fact that I didn't have to make those predictions, because I'm much better at analyzing what has happened as opposed to what is going to happen. I am a former member of Congress. I served in the Congress from 1982 to 1994. At the time I was elected, I was the youngest African American who had ever been elected to Congress. I believe Congresswoman Lauren Underwood enjoys that position right now, and she's certainly someone we look to who's making a big difference in the Congress now. Since that time, I ran for the United States Senate, won the Democratic nomination in Missouri, but did not win the general election. Went to work for CARE, the hunger relief organization, worked on President Clinton's reelection campaign as his deputy campaign manager, and shortly thereafter established Wheat Government Relations. And now I have been joined by my partner, Julie Shroyer, and we have had the privilege of working for NASW for about 6 or 7 years now as the lobbying team in Washington, D.C.
That's fantastic. My first question to you, though, is, since you said that you served in Congress from 1982 to 1984. So
94, sorry.
94, right, exactly.
12
So
years in Congress.
over a decade. And
Mhm.
I'm sure that you have been in both a minority and in a majority. And looking at how Congress is starting out, this 118th Congress, uh, with them struggling to have a speaker named, um, I would like to hear from you. Is this different than any other time when it comes to the functioning of Congress?
I can't say it's different than any other time because we had the historical references back to the 1800s.
Mhm.
So, but it is certainly different than any time in anyone's living memory of how the Congress has operated. And I happen to be a Democrat, and it was the Republicans' job to organize the House of Representatives, but it's not a good sign for anyone that they had such great difficulty and went through such chaos in trying to get the Congress going and being able to organize. It portends what may happen as they face difficult issues of things that must be done, not only for the Congress to operate, but for the nation to operate.
Mhm.
Uh, and for instance, look at the debt limit, the debt ceiling that Janet Yellen has announced that we have reached already. And we all know that the Treasury will be able to take extraordinary measures to keep the country operating for several months. But if we have to depend on the same people who prevented Kevin McCarthy from becoming Speaker for several days to pass the debt ceiling limit extension, we're facing great difficulty. They're much better at creating chaos than they are at actually creating legislation and order.
Right. So, with that said, what role can social workers play?
Well, social workers have to play a role in every aspect of the Congress functioning and of passing legislation. Now, we have our own legislation that we are trying to move in the Congress, the Improving Access to Mental Health Act, which we hope is going to pass this Congress, and we're looking for additional co-sponsors, and we'll be asking social workers to play an active role in that. But social work is unique in that our agenda isn't just about the social work about social workers itself. It's about a whole realm of social justice issues, whether it's critical race theory or whether it's crime, whatever the area is. Social workers are deeply involved. So there are about 100,000 members of NASW, and we should all be proud of that. But there are 700,000 social workers in this country. So I consider the social workers in NASW to be the activists, and they do a great job of reaching out to members of Congress, reaching out to senators, and having their voices be heard. But we can multiply that several times over by getting other social workers involved also. And Mitt mentioned the new CEO of NASW who will be joining, and she's given him a mission of increasing the number of social workers. And if you look at his background, it's very impressive. So he and Barbara Bedney and her team will be working to increase the members and to make sure the members are more active than ever in reaching out to people in the House, people in the Senate, and making sure that our voices are heard.
Absolutely. And I did have the good fortune of meeting Mr. or Dr. E Street at the SWIR conference, and he has a vision for social workers around the nation to definitely become more active and engaged. So I'm excited about that. And you spoke about reaching out to members of Congress and just elected officials in general to support efforts that align with our values. Like writing letters or making phone calls or making themselves known in the district offices. How effective was that type of work that social workers do as far as advocating? How effective was that for you when you were a sitting member of Congress? Did it matter that people called or sent postcards, or was that just a waste of time?
It can be very effective, and I like to tell people the story about an elderly woman who unfortunately has passed away by the name of Margaret Hogan, who lived in my district. And I would get letters and phone calls from constituents, and obviously my staff and I would be focused on trying to respond to them. And in responding, we'd learn more about the issues. But one issue in particular, in involving taxing the internal buildup of, well, it's a technical issue, but it affected elderly people's portfolios and they didn't want them taxed. Margaret Hogan wrote me 9 different times about this issue. And I picked up the phone and called her, and we ended up chatting several different times. And ultimately, I changed my vote in Congress because of her advocacy on this single issue. And I'm not the only member of Congress that happened to. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it doesn't matter. If you're in a member of Congress's district, you need to reach out to that person. You may not be able to convince them on every issue, but the 1 or 2 issues where you're able to influence them will make a difference.
There you go. You're preaching to the choir. I agree 100%. And but I want to transition a little bit now. We have such a great panel, so I want to go to Juliana. And I want to speak to you about what's happening currently on the ground in South Carolina. First of all, could you introduce yourself to the listening audience, the viewing audience, and give them a little background, a little history on this particular bill? I think it's House Bill 3515.
That's correct, Marla. Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. Happy New Year to everybody out there. And for all those social workers in South Carolina that are watching tonight, thank you for joining us, and everybody else. You know, I'm Juliana Paliak, and I am the executive director here for the South Carolina chapter. I've been with NASW now over 11 years now, and in this role for 2. We have seen bills in this state, you know, all over the place, all over the map. House Bill 3515, which is also known as the Entrepreneur Freedom Act, was introduced last week, was passed onto the Labor, Commerce, and Industry Committee. It is yet to be assigned to a subcommittee. However, when we got wind of this, of course, it was all hands on deck. So I am blown away. I was telling Mitt earlier how blown away I am at the response of the social workers in South Carolina. This bill actually does not just affect social workers, it's teachers, speech therapists, audiologists, dietitians, landscape architects, hair braiders. I'm trying to think, I know I'm leaving some out, but to lump all of us together in that, what I found, everybody is coming together. We have been, for the past, for myself and a few of our board members, my president, Dr. Aubrey Sayet, and I have been working very diligently behind the scenes before we really brought this forward to the membership to get more involved, which was 2 days ago. I have heard from hundreds of social workers in the past 24 hours saying, I've reached out, I've done this, what else can I do? And it's something I've just never seen before, and I'm so grateful for it, and it is making a difference. We are finally getting some of that pushback from these legislators. So we're very hopeful that we can get this thing, you know, killed in committee, so it'll never see the light of day on the House floor. But again, that's, you never know in this day and age that we had talked about.
I don't know. So let me, I'm glad that you gave that background information. And I know as we were preparing for this call, you were very excited to find out some new developments. Could you share that?
Absolutely. So I just found out my president, Dr. Aubrey Sayet, had, and I know she's out there watching, so I wanted to give her a shout out for that, that she has been in contact with another organization that says that we believe that some of the sponsors on the bill are taking their names off of it, which basically means all of us are driving them insane at this point. Like, you know, we're killing the bill is what we're calling it. We're killing the bill, and they're working so hard, and I am just overwhelmed what action can do. You know, I love to tell people writing letters, emails, but phone calls make a huge difference. I talked to one of the legislative aides today, and she said, I've heard from you 7 times. And I said, that's exactly right. And you're going to hear from me again until he calls me back. So I feel like it is definitely making a difference.
Absolutely. And it's exactly what Congressman we just spoke about, right? It's that persistence of really standing up and speaking out time and time again until we get the solution that we want to see happen. And also, you know, what you just spoke about is a good demonstration of how we need to build coalitions, right? So that the movement can really grow exponentially. But let's get back to what this bill particularly says, because it's around a topic that we're talking about nationally, which is licensure, right? And so, you know, there's confusion. This is not about social workers not having to sit for the licensure exam. This is about professionals having a license to practice, right? Um, all professions, like you said before. So, what would happen if licensure didn't exist?
Well, you know, it's hard to wrap your head around that when you think about it. So we have had multiple conversations. I've talked with so many social workers about this and exactly what is this going to mean? Well, first of all, we no longer have a license, which means billing for your Medicaid, Medicare, insurance, all of that goes away because you have to be licensed in South Carolina or any state to have that procedure. So what are they going to do about that? There's no regulation. Anybody would be able to be a social worker.
Right.
It blows your mind to think about the ramifications and the ripple effect of what getting and repealing licensure. At first, of course, I'm just like all social work, but at this point, I'm also thinking about all the other professions as well. And the ripple effect of that. My mother was she's retired now, a speech therapist in the public school system. When I called her 2 nights ago to tell her about this, she was outraged. She got on the phone and started calling all. So this is something that is affecting everybody in some way, shape, or form. And for social workers, this is the livelihood.
Right.
This is everything.
Yeah, and I love how you said this is something that affects everyone, which in actuality, everything affects everyone. And so, you know, we have to find a way to communicate that so that people can join us in these fights that we're fighting, right? And so it's really all about messaging. You were able to get it out there so people saw how this impacted them. It was about messaging. And thank you so much for joining this conversation. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in South Carolina. And thank you so much for creating the bridge to our next guest, which is Mr. Cowan, because I'm up here talking about messaging. I'm a big person or a big champion for individuals that are good storytellers, because storytellers are people that are able to grab people's attention and possibly move them to action. So, Mr. Cowan, being in the media, I want you to share with our viewers, first of all, who you are, and you know what you do with Reuters, and how important is it that we know how to communicate and connect with journalists so that they understand the work that we're doing and how important we are in the political space?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me into this conversation. And it sounds like the work that you do is really interesting and ought to be interesting to a lot of journalists. Basically, what do? I work for Reuters. If you're not familiar with it, it's an international wire service. It's been around since the mid-1800s. And we have reporters and bureaus all over the world. In the United States, we have reporters in all major cities and people who are freelancers for us, both reporters and photographers all throughout the country. And as for myself, I'm based in Washington, D.C. I've been with Reuters for a little bit over 20 years. And a lot of that time I've spent on Capitol Hill covering Congress. Sometimes I've specialized on specific issues such as climate change and Congress's attempts to address climate change. I've written a lot about immigration issues, fiscal issues. I've done some campaigns and election coverage. And now I have to say that the last 5 or 6 years have been the most intensive, grueling, and action-packed. And by action-packed, I don't necessarily mean Congress passing legislation, because often it doesn't. The last couple of years, it has done a lot. We're switching gears now a little bit with the midterm elections that occurred last November, with Republicans taking the House of Representatives from Democrats, although by nowhere near the margin that the experts and politicians were predicting. The red wave, a big Republican win in the House, did not occur. And so what the country is seeing is a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, controlled Senate, and a Democratic president. And in Congress, both the Senate and House, Democrats very narrowly control the Senate, and a little bit more than last year. And in the House, Republicans have the narrowest of margins. And all that matters. It matters because it's even more difficult to do legislation. And it makes for very colorful scenes, like we saw just a week or two ago, when it took something like 14 or 15 separate votes to just elect a speaker. There's usually one vote, and that usually does it. But Kevin McCarthy had such a difficult time because of the narrow margin he is working with, that it was a real struggle. And that struggle is probably going to continue now that they're moving on to legislation. I know there's a lot of focus on, and it sounds like from your organization, there are fears over, the changes that could be made with a conservative Republican majority in the House. But it's worth keeping in mind that the House is not the only word or the last word. So, the Senate will weigh in, and President Biden will weigh in, and it should be a really interesting year, 2 years. The very big story over this year is most likely to be, it might sound technical, and it is sort of esoteric, but it's really important. It's two things. And it all revolves around money. Bills to fund the government, to fund virtually every federal activity that occurs, and the debt limit, the federal debt limit, which means how much can the federal government borrow in order to fund the activities it's doing, which operate at a deficit because there's an imbalance between spending and revenues. And part of that is on the spending ledger, and part of that is on the tax ledger. And so that's the overall landscape right now.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain to our audience, when we talk about fiscal bills and in budget talks, could you paint a picture of how that is relevant to social work? Because when I think about budget talks, Joe Biden always said, if you want to know somebody's values, look at their budget. And so if we have fears about the way that Congress is leaning, what does that look like regarding policies, programs, and funding for communities that we're working with, for programs that we rely on? Why is it important that social workers understand the discussion about the debt ceiling? Why should we know about budget or care?
There are very good reasons that you should know about it and care about it. And I think that especially for people just coming into the field, it seems like a really big, scary, complicated thing. It is big, and it can be complicated, but it doesn't necessarily have to be scary, and you can plunge into it. And I think that maybe the important thing to do is to not even think of it as budget and debt limit and appropriations. And those are all words that most Americans don't use and don't really know the importance of, other than it's big and maybe it's dry and boring. But you people come into contact with Americans, I'm guessing, every day, who have really fascinating stories. And their lives and their stories will be directly impacted by the budgets that Congress passes, because it's funding programs that you're very interested in. And the debt limit will have a very direct impact on whether or not those programs can continue, if they will continue in sort of a modified way, maybe a much more narrow way, in a way that maybe you will see is insufficient. And this is your opportunity to try to mold it. Where I come in is so we're writing already almost every day about the debt limit, believe it or not. And it's something that this battle isn't really going to play out maybe for a few months, maybe by midsummer. Then, Congress is very driven by deadlines, and it knows it has a likely deadline of maybe June or so. But now is the perfect time to, both educate the public, and that's what we're trying to do. Then the public being, just sort of a general readership, but also financial markets are really interested in this. And so we're covering it really closely. And it's easy to cover it, and we can interview members of Congress. They're very accessible. But what is more difficult, especially for somebody in Washington, covering it on a national or international level, is getting in touch with people who are directly affected by these decisions.
Right.
And if if you are looking for ways to contact reporters and get them interested in your viewpoints and the work that you're doing, it helps to know what the direct impact is of the decisions being debated in Congress. And if you, for example, could, I can write about what a particular member of Congress thinks and what a particular person in the Biden administration thinks, but it can be really driven home if I can paint a little bit of a picture of what is going on with somebody, say, in South Carolina or Missouri or California or wherever, and how they might be directly impacted by these decisions. And I know you're not just interested in the national level. If I could just say something quickly about state and local, and that is that it's a whole. The journalism industry has changed vastly over the last couple decades with the internet, and it's much more difficult now for on all sides, because so many newspapers have gone out of business over the last couple decades, or if they're still in business, they have very small staffs, and those very small staffs are pressed, and you really have to work a little bit harder to find people who are covering the issues you're interested in, and then cultivating a relationship with them so that they can trust you and you trust them, and that they're knowledgeable about the issues. There's still ways to do it. It's just tougher. And I think that people just getting into the field should realize that. But that's not to say that you should give up on it. I think it means you need to work even harder.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I see that, you're really hitting on some good stuff, because everybody around the screen is like, yep, what he said. So that's exactly what we wanted to hear. And now I want to transition over to you, Barbara, and if you could just tell everyone who you are and what you do. And this is a good little segue because chief of programs, like I said before, people are always questioning what can I do, and like I always say, get in where you fit in. There are things happening throughout the country, and there are ways that we can be engaged in systems that already exist. So Barbara, the floor is yours. Could you please introduce yourself, what you do, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I am Barbara Bedney. I'm Chief of Programs here at NASW. I have a background in social work and sociology, so I like theory and practice. I have been here a relatively short time, just a couple of months. So it is a great honor and a great privilege to be here with everybody on this call, with all of you, and to be part of this discussion. I have a couple of thoughts sort of about what's going on here and how social workers can be involved. I can get started with those if that's okay.
Please.
So I think, one of the questions is in terms of programs and how social workers can get involved. And I've been thinking about that question. And I think there's a number of structures and processes and principles that we can think of as we go forward, right? That we can use as guidelines. And certainly one of them is our code of ethics, right? And we can always keep that in mind, that we are here to enhance well-being, and that is individual well-being and societal well-being, right? So we can always keep that in mind as a hallmark of what we're going to do. I think we can always keep in mind our timeline. And by that, I mean, we can think about our history as a profession and the profound changes that we have led as a profession, and the leaders that we can look on in the past and see what they've done. It's always been social work that has gotten through hard times. It will be social work again that gets us through those hard times. So looking at that past and the leaders and what's been done before, I think can be very helpful to us. At the same time, we have leaders now who we can turn to, many of whom are on the call as we speak, to look at their inspiration and wisdom and their experience and what can they teach us. And looking towards the future, the problems that we're talking about, we might not be able to solve them all. There's a good chance of that. So how do we nurture the next generation of leaders? What can we pass down? That kind of wisdom, that kind of experience, that kind of persistence that has come up on the call, because we're going to need everybody to be involved in this. So I think that we can look at it that way and begin to then nurture the next generation of leaders. We have a set of public policy priorities that anybody can look at. They're on our website that, again, can help us guide our work and our future and what we're going to do. We're talking about civil and social justice, economic justice, you name it, across the board, and those we can infuse in whatever programs and innovations we develop going forward. And maybe my favorite one, as I was thinking about this, is the skills that we have as a profession, right? And that may be our sort of secret weapon going forward as we talk about breaking barriers, right? That's one of the things we're here to talk about. So what are the skills, and I would love to have this conversation, what are the unique skills that social work and social workers can bring to these issues to advance the goals that we have, right? I have a couple of things on my list. One is think about assessment, right? We all do assessment in social workers. So in this case, it's what do we know about these problems? What's causing them? What's the background? What's the context? What are the issues? And then going forward from there, right? So really looking at those problems that we're talking about. Social workers are great, I think, at goal setting and strategic planning and thinking this is where we want to go. How do we get there? What's the steps involved? How do we do that step by step and be able to get to that goal? Social workers engage in what we call, as you all know, strengths-based approaches, right? So what assets do we have as a field? What resources can we bring to bear on these types of issues? I think that's a great resources that we have. It's just part of who we are and part of what we do. You've heard it on the call before, partnership building, engagement, coalitions, all of that. Who does that better than social work, right? It's part of who we are. It's part of what we do. We're going to need all of that going forward. How do we reach out to potential partners? How do we know who potential partners are that we can think about? What do those partners look like? How do we engage people where they are? Key aspect of social work, right? How do we move forward based on where people are? I think there's creativity and innovation in social work. that excels beyond anything else you might find anywhere else, right? I think we can bring that to bear as we start talking about innovative programs that might incorporate some of these issues. I have a background in sociology, as I said. Obviously, research and data is important. I think the more data that we can collect in terms of understanding social problems, in terms of developing innovations, in terms of evaluating some of the solutions, all of that can be important. We've talked about it on the call, the power of the collective. I think we're going to need each other, right, to get through this and to understand what our power is. 700,000 of us, whatever it is out there in terms of social work, that's an enormous power that we can figure out how to take advantage of and move forward on some of these issues. Social workers talk a lot about empowerment, right? That's one of the things we can bring to bear on this. And part of that, I think, and we talk about the collective, is being able to support each other. There are challenging times and difficult times, and we need to be able to support each other. We need to be able to share challenges and lessons learned and issues and all of that. And we need to be able to support each other in that kind of environment as we go forward. The other thing I would add to that, because it is a difficult environment, we might want to think about including some of those trauma-informed principles in that, as we go forward and thinking about some of these things, right? The key aspect of that, the first part of that is safety, right? We have to be able to create a safe environment for ourselves, for this difficult work going forward. I think we can do that here. I thank everybody on this call. I thank Mitt. I thank Marla. It's great to meet you, for creating this environment where we can do that. And the other thing I would say is keep up to date with NASW. We have some amazing resources on our website. We have a report there that was literally called Undoing Racism Through Social Work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
saying that, just saying that is enormously empowering. Undoing racism through social work. That's what we're here to do, right? So check out our resources. There's a lot there. Keep in touch with us. And again, my pleasure just to be here with you all and to take any questions.
Barbara, you answered the questions that I was going to pose. So I thank you for it. And I also I hope that Richard will write an article on social work undoing racism. And see this as an opportunity. Here's a story in and of itself, right? That there's a workforce that is really up for the challenge. Some of the major challenges that we're facing today when it comes to racism and hatred and just attacks on our rights, on our civil rights, our human rights. And so, Barbara, that's where programming comes into play. As we have this new visionary leader of Dr. E Street, which, by the way, I know that he was watching earlier and he did comment that he was on. So we're very happy and excited that he is picking up the mantle and continuing this work. I think in February, I think that's when he starts. But as far as programming is concerned for you, Barbara, how can NASW implement programming that will effectively address this new policy agenda shift that's rooted in racism and attacks on women's rights that's taking place right now on the state and federal level? You know, how can we implement programming that specifically brings those words into action? We have these priorities. How do we make it, almost like an actionable a manual, like get to it. This is what you do. That what kind of programming is there being designed or developed or implemented that EDs or individuals on the state level like Juliana can use, right? People like Alan can use in his lobbying efforts, tie it together. He's on the Hill lobbying for this. They're on the ground doing that. Kevin's in class learning about it. And then he's going to go out and do it himself. And then Richard's going to write about it and make us all look like superheroes and get a Pulitzer Prize. There you go.
You got the answer right there. That's it.
That's what I want to see happen. So my question to you is, what programming are you implementing? And when can we get started?
So it's a great question. As I said, I've been here a short time, so I don't have the answer to that yet.
Yeah, time's ticking, girl. Time's a ticking, right?
Right, exactly. Part of that is, if you look at that document, that Undoing Racism Through Social Work, there are a series of recommendations in there. There are policy recommendations, practice recommendations, training, education. There are some great recommendations there. I would encourage everybody to look at that report. It's well done.
And there it is, right there. It was just shared on the screen, and we will make sure that we share that with all of our viewers. They just put the link up there. So you took the bait, Barbara. That's exactly where I was hoping you'd go.
There you go. The question, but you ask a great question, right? How do we build off of that?
Right.
How do we go from there and implement those recommendations? And that might be, you know, it's something, boy, I would love to hear from everybody on that call, because like I said, I'm new assistant. I want to learn how to do that well, because that's the next step, is once you have those principles, you build off of the structure from them going forward, right? I would, first thing I would do is sort of see what else is going on out there in the field, right? And talk to people and say, what are you seeing? Again, that's the sociology aspect of things. What are you seeing out there? What's happening? My understanding is this. Let's get as full a picture as we can, okay? And then say, okay, how do we go forward as a collective? And to me, again, it's about keeping the collective in mind and understanding what our power is, and being able to understand where we can send resources over here and share information. I think the chapters and what's going on across the country is one of our greatest resources. Juliana, you're going to see things I'm not going to see. People on this call are going to see. But the more you can let us know what's going on, we can develop an understanding of all those things, and then develop a figure out how to go forward from here on the policy level, on the practice level, on the educational level. How do we get everybody involved in all of this? I think this is somebody said all hands on deck. This is an all hands on deck. I think the people on this call are the guardians of social work, and are going to take us that next step. And I do not have the answer yet, but boy, we're working on it, and we're going to get there, because the people on this call are the one who's going to do it.
Well, you actually did answer the question, so thank you very much for that.
It is my great pleasure.
So, Kevin, you are our hope. You are the future of social work.
There you go.
We're gonna finish it with you, and I just want to ask you, as a beginning social worker, how do you get other beginning social workers excited to take action, as opposed to feeling disillusioned at the gate? You know, I teach a community organizing class, and this morning we were doing the introductions, and so I asked many of them, were they clinical students or were they management and policy students, because that's how you start a class. And many of them were clinical students, but they said to me they were already feeling burnt out. And the MAP students, after seeing what has been happening recently in Congress, and like Mitch said at the top of this call, what's happening on the state level when it comes to some of the policies and pieces of legislation that's being passed to take away people's rights, they're feeling hopeless. So, you know, it's very hard to get somebody to move to action when they don't even feel like it's their degree is going to get them some kind of solution. How can we get beginning social workers excited about taking action?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Marla. And just to give a little brief background, so I wear many hats. I'm currently a second year macro student in the master's program at Howard University School of Social Work, with a field of practice of criminal justice. So macro students, you know, I feel you. We have a lot of work to do. Also, I am interning now with NASW as a governance intern, directly supporting President Joyner. And so being able to learn from her and to serve and help her to carry out her mission has been an honor. And I'm looking forward to the coming months before graduation in May to do as much as I can to help the organization. Currently, I serve as the chairman of the Commission on Fathers, Men, and Boys here in Washington, D.C. I was appointed by Mayor Bowser last year. And I also am the founder of my own nonprofit, the Thomas Foundation, which is geared towards civic engagement and just encouraging people to use their talents to be of use and to help improve the quality of life of all individuals, with a specific emphasis on the most vulnerable. And to the question, so one thing I will say, my cohort we have a very strong relationship in which, you know, we dialogue about all the issues that are out there. There seems like there's so many issues to the point where there's literally no way to not be able to pick some type of issue to advocate for, because there's just so many, especially in this polarizing environment. And so I think first, before we even get to the self-care aspect of it, we have to make sure that beginning social workers, whether it be current students or those just entering the profession post-graduation, they have to feel supported. They need to feel like they're part of a community that is in lockstep and that has one another's back. You think back to like the civil rights movement. One of the reasons why those individuals that, you know, those that we know and those that we don't know on a first name basis, the reason why they were able to advocate so fearlessly is because they knew that even if they ended up, you know, whether they were imprisoned, whether they had dogs, put on them, whether they had water hoses shot on them, they were all in it together. And they didn't have to necessarily think about, you know, whether they had someone at least watching out for them as they put their lives on the line for the betterment of society. And so as a profession, we have to support one another. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder, and we're literally like a family, and families stick together. And so we have to make sure that we're supporting one another, make sure that we're there for each other, that we're able to have those conversations when we feel weary, and able to motivate each other to keep going in the fight, no matter how, you know, demoralizing it may get. So that would be the first thing. Also, to go back regarding the social work students, we have to get away from the notion that you have to wait until you get your degree in order for you to be active. When you think about the fact that, you know, we have internships, whether it be clinical or whether it be a policy internship, we're being thrown right into the fire of helping the organizations that we're working with to achieve their mission. And so just like in any other profession, whether it be law or medicine, the best way to become your best self as an advocate is to be thrown in the fire and to get that experience. And so we need to encourage our students and the schools of social work to have those opportunities there for students to be active in their community. Here at Howard, I mean, we have no excuse. We literally are about 5 or 6 miles away from the seat of the most powerful government in the world. And so we should be down on Capitol Hill, not only on Advocacy Day, but pretty much any day, especially now because there's so much at stake with this new Republican government or controlled House, and a slim majority, of course, for Democrats in the Senate. And so we have to make sure that we are being vocal, that we're being seen. And just to say, some organizations are so well known of showing up to the Congress and people's offices to where they are feared on the Hill. And as a member of the Divine Nine, I shout out the women of Delta Sigma Theta, because even when Loretta Lynch, Attorney General Loretta Lynch, was going through her confirmation hearing, they showed up in full force. And as you see, they got what they wanted. And so as a community, as a profession, we have to be that active, that supportive, and stick together in their strength in numbers. So that's one way, definitely, I think, to achieve that.
That was perfect. I mean, you said so many things, and you know, I want us to be feared on the Hill as well. I want state houses to shake when social workers show up. You know, I want our presence to be felt and known. And so I want to go back to you, Congressman Wheat, being a lobbyist, knowing that reputation matters in order to get into these rooms. And the same for you, Richard. You know, in order to get that interview, people need to know your name, or at least have respect for Reuters, or for, you know, who you're representing as the NASW lobbyist. How do you build those relationships? Because we know that, and Richard, you might not know, but one of the 6 core values of social work is the importance of human relationships. I mean, that's something that we are trained to believe. And so how do you maintain these relationships so that you can, do the work that you're charged to do, whether it be lobbying or writing honest and impactful, articles and stories, or designing programs, or advocating for people on the ground, or motivating and inspiring your classmates to get out and get to work now. So that question is for all of you. How do you build these relationships, and how do you maintain them?
First, let me point out in regard to politics that this is about values. It's not. People often say, "Well, what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and why should I care? And what difference is it going to make?" It's not like a sporting event where you're rooting for the uniform, for one team to win or the other. It is about values and trying to support people who support the same kind of values that we've been talking about, that Barbara and Juliana talked about in terms of what social workers stand for. So part of this equation is helping those people get elected to office. And Marla, I know you're very familiar with that process. And social workers can be a great workforce in that regard, because social workers have credibility. I say we, my partner Julie Shroyer is a social worker. My mother was a social worker, and I've been working for social workers for a very long time. And I see how respected social workers are on the Hill. But we have to create personal relationships also. We have to be a resource for the members of Congress and for the state legislators, even those who don't agree with us and who don't espouse our values immediately, because it's those personal relationships over time that can make a difference in how they regard us and how they regard the issues upon which we're working. So I think it's incumbent upon every social worker to create at least 1 or 2 relationships with elected officials, because those relationships will pay off in the long run.
Absolutely. And just so that those that have joined us on YouTube can join in this conversation, please post any question or comment, and I will direct it to our panel so that you too can join the conversation and ask these great individuals questions. Alan, I appreciate you sharing that. And I would love to hear from anyone else regarding, how these relationships are important and how to sustain them. Because I know, as being someone who is a political social worker, that's really what it's all about. It's really about having those personal connections, and rooting everything that we do in our values. I'm glad, Alan, that you spoke about not being partisan. I know that when you were in Congress, you were the president. I mean, the what is it called? The head of the CBC.
I was chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and something that you did that was very much in alignment with social work was that you opened it up so that non-African Americans could be associate members, because we value relationships, partnerships, coalitions. We know we can get more done. You know?
Richard was pointing out earlier that the small group in the House, and it doesn't run the House, and the House itself needs the Senate and it needs the president. When we were in the Congressional Black Caucus, at that time a very small group of 18 members of Congress, there was little we could get done on our own. But being able to reach out to the rest of the House of Representatives, to create allies in the House, in the Senate, and of course to work with a president, whether it was President Bush or President Clinton, it was important, and it's still important today. Obviously, President Biden has reached out to social workers and included our former CEO, Dr. McClain, and in several different activities. But we want to continue that relationship, and we want to build on it so that the legislation that we're promoting in the House right now can be supported not only by Democrats, and we've had We've had a multitude of Democrats sign on to our legislation, but frankly, we need Republicans to sign on also. And if they hear from social workers, and if social workers create a relationship with them, we believe we can get this done.
I think that if I could jump in, if that's okay, this question about how to establish relationships is such a great question and so foundational. As a journalist, this really applies now because, we've just come off of, 4 years of the Trump administration, where one of his marquee lines was the fake media, they lie, they're slanted, you can't trust a word they say. And people, we've seen that things that President Trump or any president says, they gain traction with the public. And so in creating relationships, I now sort of have to convince people that I might be calling cold who don't know me, say in your community or, any particular community, that I'm going to give them a fair shake. And I think what's important for new reporters coming into the business is as important for social workers, and that is do your homework, and you'll gain the trust of members of Congress, I would guess, and Mr. Wheat would have a much better idea on this than I would. But I've noticed that in building sources, if I come to them and they see that I've done a little bit of homework and that I kind of know what I'm talking about, or at least can ask some of the right questions, that's so important. And then building on that, if they can trust me to treat them the way that, according to the rules we've established. I'm not going to quote them if they say they don't want to be quoted. If they put something off the record, I'll keep it off the record, and that I will fairly represent what they were saying in stories. And those are not special to the world of journalism. I think that applies to, every profession, and even, people not working in a profession in their day-to-day jobs. It's difficult now in this environment. I once, a few years ago, I was filling in for one of our White House reporters who wanted to go to the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner and never could because, the president usually speaks there and they had to cover it. And but it was different with Trump. He didn't attend that annual dinner, and, which is perfectly, it's totally up to him whether, the president wants to come there and speak or not. And so what he would do is he would arrange MAGA rallies in cities on the same night as the dinner. And so they asked me if I would fill in for them. And I flew out on Air Force One to Madison, Wisconsin. And there, the president was doing his job was to rally up his supporters. And, sure as could be, there was that moment where he said, look over there, look at those reporters. And we were all penned together. And he basically called us liars. And, it was something that, you have 16,000 people booing you. And that experience, I think, then ripples out. And you have to overcome whatever disadvantage you're at. And you overcome it by, I think, doing your homework and being honest about, the way you conduct your business. And then people trust you and they're more willing to listen to what you're arguing or confide in you.
Richard, you touched on something two things. First of all, a second core value is integrity. So what you just spoke about was operating with integrity, being someone that will present the truth at all costs. But when we talk about at all costs, right now, what is happening, I'd say from 2016, maybe even earlier, but very much so now, the hatred and just the vitriol in politics right now, and how dangerous it is to take a stance and to really fight for social justice. Juliana, I can only imagine what it's like in South Carolina, trying to stand up and fight for positions that may not be politically popular.
Right.
How do we, because this is about safety. In order to have people want to come and join a movement, they first have to feel safe that, that I'm going to be okay if I do this work. Can you talk to me about that? About what are you hearing from your members that want to be involved in creating change in this world, but fear that it's dangerous? I mean, like Richard said, there are news outlets that are kind of fanning the fire, and it really matters that people know that this is a dangerous time, but it's also necessary work. So, what are you seeing?
So I think in South Carolina, like many of you know, it is kind of uh, hit or miss on certain things. And what I mean by that is, for instance, this year we had another anti-abortion bill that came about, and we did have some social workers that said, I just don't feel comfortable, putting my name next to this, or how are ways that I can do behind the scenes. I don't want to come. There was a rally at the State House, I think it was February of last year, on this, and the president at the time, Dr. Sylvia Rogers, and I went and we did the protest, and we stayed the day there, and it was the lowest turnout. And I'm not sure if it was because of the political climate. People were scared to come, because there's always threats, right? And so I think at this point, with what we're dealing with now in South Carolina for the social workers licensure, up on the block, and people are like, we can't sit by for this. And I think this is, like I said, it depends on the issues. It also depends on what's going on in the state at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular thing has lit a fire under us and a lot of others that are non-social workers as well, to voice their opinion. And so I also want to touch on one other thing we were just talking about. How do you develop those relationships with the senators and your representatives, or even like county council, anything on that level as well. Respect is very important that I see, because we are such a very red state and there's a lot of issues. We're not going to always agree on things, but I can't go into these offices or send these emails or phone calls with hate-filled or aggression. And and there are sometimes it's hard to do that. I understand that. But to have a level head. And what I've learned is when you are able to go and have these conversations like that with these legislators, they respect us,
right,
in the same term. So anything I can do to make it easy on both of us. I come prepared. I have my list of, not demands, but my list of things that I want to discuss and why this is not going to work or why it should work. I feel that they respect us, even, just the constituents in general, when we are prepared to have these conversations, not to just go up there and say, we're against this.
Right.
They want to know why as well, just like we want to know why you're bringing this forward. So I think respect, learning to negotiate a little bit, that's a big deal in this state, and trying to compromise. And that's something that's really, really hard here. But I have seen compromise the past few days on the other side, with the Republicans on this. So I'm very optimistic with that. This is something that, is going to affect so many people. But respect is the number one thing. We have to respect one another's opinions. You don't have to down someone because we don't feel the same way, but show them why, and they will change. I've seen it firsthand with just this bill.
I love it. I love leading with respect. I think that it's critical. So I see we have a question from Genesis Lane, and it reads, in what ways can social workers advocate even more for mental health resources in the workforce? Great question.
there's going to be I mean, to get into the weeds, appropriations bills. There will be the annual spending bill there are 12 of them, and the one that covers HHS, it's known as the Labor HHS and Education Spending Bill, and that would be one of the places where funding for mental health resources will be debated and hashed out, and whether there will be cuts or they'll tread water or increase funding in certain areas. And that would be a place to start, I would think, either with a subcommittee chairman or a ranking, the minority party ranking member of a subcommittee that is handling that bill, for example.
That's an excellent place to start. And there's also funding of programming on the state level. And so I think it is imperative that every social worker, anybody who hears my voice, that they understand the power of politics on the state and local level. We're seeing what's happening in schools, banning readings, changing curriculum to exclude people's voices and representation. We need to be at school board meetings. We need to be at city council meetings. We need to be in the state house, where there are millions of dollars that are allocated to services on the state level. So make sure you're registered to vote, know your representatives, and make sure that they know you. First, build the relationship. Back to the relationship. So that's my 2 cents, and that's what I know to be true.
If I could just add real quick, access to mental health services is a priority for us, Alan. I don't know if you know maybe a little bit more than I do, but I know it is something, and you can check it on our website. Genesis, I think if I'm saying your name right, it was a great question, and it's obviously a critical issue that you're talking about there. So thank you for raising that.
It is a critical issue and one of the top priorities of NASW. And I know I've referred to it before, but it was in the last Congress, HR 2035 in the House of Representatives, introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And it was a companion Senate bill by Senator Stabenow. The bills have not yet, the House bill has not yet been introduced into this session of Congress. It has to be introduced newly each session of Congress. But this bill specifically would increase mental health services. It, for instance, would make health behavior assessment and intervention more available in nursing homes. So it's a vital piece of legislation. We are working very hard to get Republicans in particular to co-sponsor this legislation. So the point that Juliana made, that you have to show them respect, that's important, and we need to create the relationships with them and convince them of the need to provide their constituents with these services. And once they see the benefits of the services to their constituents, we believe they can make the appropriate funding decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we have from Judith Crocker, Mr. Cowan, as a social policy and social work and the media professor with social work students in attendance today from Johnson C. Smith's University, what type of exposure or assignments do you suggest for social work and the media students that are related to social policy? Before you answer, Dr. Crocker, I saw your name and I saw all of the students saying hello as we started this. Thank you so much for having them join us today. I think that is critical, and I am grateful that you decided to embed us into your syllabus. So, Mr. Cowan, could you answer that question?
I will try to. I don't know that I can in a satisfactory way, because I don't necessarily have the grounding in social work that might be needed to answer that. But what I can say is that, for media students or social work students, pick pick a subject, a topic, and maybe make it a narrow one so it's not too unwieldy, that you think is important, and that you would like either to write something about it or affect an outcome on it. And so, just for example, not related directly to social work, but okay, so Republicans are talking about freezing spending. Republicans in the U.S. House are talking about freezing spending at 2022 levels. I mean, so that is a gigantic topic. I would like to know, for example, so if you do that, what would happen to there's the food stamp program, which is known as SNAP, that helps poor families get their nutritional needs by buying basic food commodities. So what exactly would that mean to somebody who is currently getting a benefit and might see their benefit either frozen or cut, and who, for example, might really feel the impact of that? So, that's just an example of, the zillions of things that will be affected by this big debate that Washington is going to have, and even at the state and local level over the next several months. So I'm afraid I don't know the answer specifically to the question, but I think on the approach to just determine, what are you really interested in? What would you like to protect or change?
Mm-hmm.
And then go for it and figure out the way to best accomplish that.
Would anyone else care to answer that question before we jump to the next question? No? You can't think of any assignments that the professor could give her students? I could think of a million of them. First, watch the State of the Union. There are a million. This is the most diverse Congress that we have ever had. The most members in the Congressional Black Caucus. Identify a member of Congress and find out what are the issues that matter to them, and if they align with your own personal values, and reach out to them. Have them email that congressperson. There are just so many ways. Get students excited and involved and engaged in issues that matter to them, and the work that they want to do post-graduation, the work that they are interested in. If it's immigration, then get them to work on immigration policy. If it's homelessness and housing, then look for the housing advocate in Congress that speaks to that. And then secondly, just check out Maxwell Frost. I mean, he is an inspiration. He is the youngest member of Congress. He's 20 something years old. Just to follow his journey and to learn from that, and maybe to inspire the students. Those are just some examples that I have. Barbara, good. I knew I was going to get you guys talking once I started talking. That's why I started talking, because, Barbara, you're muted.
Yes, indeed. I would also think, again, just building off what's been said, is somehow bringing this down to the humanity level. Mm-hmm. That we're talking about policies and many, many dollars, but Richard, you're talking about somebody being able to eat. Mm-hmm. And somebody being able to have a stable place to live, right? And that's what this ultimately comes down to. And I don't know, my background is not in policy the way some of you all are, but that has to count for something, and we have to be able to tell those stories, right? The money translates into people's lives and their ability to live healthy, successful lives, right? And that's what we're here to do. That again goes back to our code of ethics. Right. And we have to relate those stories, I think, on some level. And maybe, Marla, that goes the question you asked me originally, is how do we do that? And that's part of my job, is to say, okay, these are people's lives. This is your family, your neighbor who might not be able to access mental health programs because those programs might get cut, or might not be able to have, again, stable housing or transportation, or if you're an older adult, have access to medications. We need to humanize some of these things in a way that maybe sometimes those get lost. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
I think it did. And to connect it to what Mr. Wheat is currently doing as he's lobbying for a specific bill, you need to find the stories that support the lobbying that he is doing. So those stories, that represent their voters, is going to move people to action. And then guess what that does too? That gets additional co-sponsors. So we're trying to get as much support behind policies that we know are impacting communities that we're trying to serve. Yes, perfect. Next question. Karina says, because the country became so polarized, how do we as social workers set aside our personal views politically to give someone the same assistance as others? Great question. And I think that it was answered earlier when we talked about respect in South Carolina. But would anyone else like to jump in on this question?
I hesitate to jump in because I'm not a social worker, but I see social workers on a daily basis understand that everyone is a human being who needs the dignity and respect that comes just from being a human being, whether they share your political views or not. So that's one of the things that I think is taught to social workers. And Kevin, I was so impressed by your story earlier. And that's what I think every social worker needs to do is, even if you don't know all of the policy impacts or who is going to win and lose from a particular piece of legislation, if you just go into a person who has some influence and tell your personal story, why you became a social worker, what it means to you, you then become a resource to that person. They rely upon you. And if you do it on a fairly regular basis, even just once a year, they'll think that you're in their office all the time. So it's critical that you undertake that kind of activity. It can motivate you to continue with the passion that made you become a social worker, and it will certainly be meaningful to the people to whom you're talking.
Very good. Any other thoughts on that? Oh, well, look, Mitt was about to ask us a question. This is going to be the last question. You can't hear from anyone else after you hear from Mitt Joyner. Dr. Mitt Joyner wants to know, how can we organize social work advocacy for every chapter to ask a specific, I think, proposed legislation that impact the most vulnerable and help to eradicate racism, hate, and violates the rights of others. So it looks like Mitt wants, how can we organize social work advocacy for every chapter so that it keeps popping up differently. So be patient with me. Okay, how can we organize social work advocacy for every chapter? I think she's talking about around proposed legislation that impacts the most vulnerable and helps to eradicate racism, hate, and violates the rights of others. So basically, how can social workers be social workers in policy? How can we stand for justice? How can we make sure that that the proposed legislation right now that's being put forth, like Mitt talked about at the very beginning, all of these challenges that are happening right now, the very things that we fought for decades. How can we advocate around those things in an effective way? And then I'm going to go around and get your final thoughts. So this is just a answer Mitt's question, people.
I'll be happy to start with that. So, with us, it is hard. There are legislation, bills that come up every year. We still have not passed a hate crime bill here in South Carolina. Right. I mean, it's been 9 years. That's hard to wrap your head around, right? It's proposed every year and it gets shot down, or they can never get it passed. But I guess what I'm saying is it is hard to do that in certain states more so than others, right? And we see that even on the federal level sometimes. But I think organizing with other organizations as well, having some camaraderie and other aspects, NASW, me maybe reaching out to the clinical social workers of South Carolina, that kind of thing, or the LPCs, that sort of thing, to form like-minded relationships. For instance, here I'm part of 2 different coalitions, one for Medicaid expansion in South Carolina. We still have not passed that. We're hoping to get that this year. Also, South Carolina Families Helping, it's an organization for grassroots organizations like-minded to get legislation passed for the underprivileged. So I think trying to form relationships that we can help one another, lobbying day, yes, and things like that. So,
and that was just put up about Lobby Day every year, and actually utilizing the wonderful lobbyists that we have in Mr. Alan Wheat. And I also think, though, that it's important to not limit ourselves to one day on the Hill. Build the relationships, know who represents you, and then advocacy can be done. But if you don't know who to advocate to about what, then what's the point? So, someone says, ask, interview a local official as a writing assignment. Yes, that's the other thing too that I wanted to ask from all of you. Could you just share with those that are watching, and then we're going to wrap this up, how easy it is to get to people that are in these positions? It's not as hard as it seems to demystify this work. Even reaching someone that is a Reuters correspondent that is creating news that circles around the globe. How it's easy, is it not, to reach people?
It is pretty easy. I mean, when people think of like trying to bring these issues to their attention, they're thinking, oh yeah, I got to go to Capitol Hill or whatever. But you can just go to some of their community events, whether they're in a parade or whether they're having a town hall. And even if you don't get FaceTime specifically with the legislator, their staff is there. So getting that contact there and just having that exchange with them and keeping your name at the forefront of their mind is a clear-cut, easy way to be able to have some sort of influence, at least be able to get in their ear and let them know, what you're passionate about. So don't only think about going to the marble halls of power. It's more local than you think. But a lot of them are very personable.
Yes. And Alan, could you finish us off?
Kevin made a great point. And in fact, it is better to see your officials in their home district or in their home community than it is in Washington, D.C. Our job is to follow up for you in Washington, D.C. And we're going to do that. If you have any questions about policy matters, we're here to answer them for you on a daily basis. Barbara has a great staff led by Sarah Butts, who the policy director, and they know everything about policy. We call them to ask questions every day when people ask us questions that we can't answer. So please make use of the national office. But when you're at home, someone wrote in, advocacy should be every day. It should be. Feel free to reach out to your legislators. And I don't want to give away the lobbying secrets, but they want to hear from you. It is easy. So make the call. Don't be hesitant.
That's right. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I was going to go around and see if you had any final thoughts that you would like to share, or we could end it right there on that note, because I thought that was beautiful. Any final thoughts?
I have maybe one or two real quick final thoughts, building on what you all just said. And that is, reporters, they're on deadline and they're trying to get a story written and out, and often need to talk to somebody quickly and try very hard to either get an interview on the phone or in person. But, I found that often I get no response, and I think, what's wrong with this person? They'll never talk to me. I would keep in mind that if you don't succeed at first, really do try again. You don't know what's going on in their lives, professionally or personally. And I've seen it happen over and over where somebody, my initial reaction was, oh, they stiffed me. And then it turns out, they had a crisis at home or work got really outrageous. And if you try again, you might just succeed. And the other thing is that, it's easy to get disillusioned, especially when you're trying to affect policy, that things don't happen quickly enough and you can become cynical. But, look at the long game, and it might take a long time, but, for me, working on a story or a series of stories, I try to keep my eye on the long game, and that just staying at it is worth it.
Wonderful. Richard, thank you so much for that comment. Thank you to the entire panel. And, I just wanted to share 2 years ago this month was January 6th. And during that insurrection, my sister, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, was trapped up in the gallery as protesters, as insurrectionists stormed the Capitol. That we have not moved that far from the threat to our democracy. And social workers need to be on the front lines in protecting this democracy and in fighting for justice. We say that that's one of our core values, so let's really be about our values. So with that said, thank you so much. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your patience. And Mitt, thank you for allowing me to do this. Bye, guys.
Thank you all.
Bye.